Last time I took a chance and I pushed it through without feeling new. And I can rely on things I've torn all down, but I build again. I always do. Though we'll never know, that's understood. 'Cause when you go left, right's gone for good. The right is gone, it's gone for good. You're gone and you made it through regret and rough times. But truth, it never judges anyone, it just pushes through, paying no mind. Though we'll never know, that's understood. Right's gone for good. Your right is gone, it's gone for good. Though we'll never know, that's understood. 'Cause when you go, right's gone for good. Your right is gone, it's gone for good.
this is the Fourth Branch Project, the first and only program which is dedicated exclusively to those with common sense, a spirit of patriotism, and a determination for a more perfect union. Welcome to the Fourth Branch Program. Glad you can make it. I am MD. This program is dedicated exclusively for those with common sense, a spirit of patriotism, and a determination for a more perfect union. Stay tuned as we begin the discussion of a very important, interesting, and enlightening topic. Hope to hear from you soon. Happy listening. Hello everyone, I am MD and this is the Fourth Branch Program. Welcome. Ignorance has never been anything other than liability. No one can strive on ignorance. Society cannot progress on ignorance. Science cannot advance on ignorance. John F. Kennedy said the ignorance of one voter in a democracy impairs the security of us all. There is no doubt and there is no way to overstate that ignorance is indeed nothing good. It's not something that anyone should look forward to. And yet, during the 2016 presidential election, several million individuals supporting Donald Trump cheered at the idea of being considered ignorant. And Donald Trump himself promoted the idea of being supported by those who are, well, ignorant. But Donald Trump's advent to the Oval Office is not anything new in the Republican Party. In fact, for several decades now, Republicans in general, Republican legislators, elected officials, have relied almost exclusively on the ignorance, the gullibility, and the naiveness of the constituent in order to keep their job in Washington, to get reelected, or in order to promote whatever agenda that they have. This is not just pure talk. We talk about that a little bit in the past. We give example of such. This is no longer a matter for debate. The Republican legislators and elected officials, even the pundits such as Fox, Rush Limbaugh, Ann Coulter, Breitbart, InfoWars, they all relied exclusively on the ignorance, the naiveness, and the gullibility of their audiences in order to strive to become financially better or to keep their, to advance their political career. The debate is not so much about whether they do that or not, but rather why. Because obviously no one can strive on ignorance. Well, at least those who benefit of search use it to their advantage. But the individual, the subject, the constituent, why do they want the Republican constituent to stay in ignorance? Is it just because they want their political career to continue to advance to the detriment of those constituents? Is it because they want to continue to make money, increase viewership, increase their coffers to the detriment of their constituent? Or is it because they just don't know that their behavior caused this type of problem to their constituent? Or is it because they're completely oblivious to the fact that what they're doing, lying, deceiving their constituent, they're completely oblivious to that fact. While once, twice could be considered as coincidences, but making a career out of lying, deceiving your constituent cannot possibly be considered, especially for legislators and elected officials, cannot possibly be considered as coincidences or accidents. In other words, it is safe to conclude that Republican legislators, Republican elected officials have deliberately chosen to lie to their constituent. It works. It has worked for decades now. As of date, we have constituents in the Republican Party who continue to argue against facts. Go figure that. Individuals who continue to deny or to be able to understand that what presented in front of them, instead of accepting, admitting, and of course becoming a little bit smarter, argue against facts. Now, all that could have been shrugged off, ignored, because it's not me, it's not any member of my family, it's not anybody that I know. So the ignorance of another individual whom I have no relationship couldn't possibly affect or impact me. Then I should just leave that alone. I could, obviously, because if I don't know an individual and that individual happened to be naive, gullible, ignorant, why should I care? Well, it so happened that it is not an isolated situation to not know an individual who is in that predicament and still be impacted by that individual. Remember, I just mentioned that JFK said that the ignorance of one voter in a democracy impairs the security of us all. In other words, I cannot simply shrug it off. I cannot simply ignore the fact that millions of individuals in the Republican Party are completely blinded by the ignorance that they embraced and cherished. But what makes it worse is not so much that they are gullible and naive and ignorant, but rather because the elected official, individual we call leaders, exploit that weakness. I can give you one example for now. We will come back to discuss. Actually, today, the discussion is the consideration of race relation, and as well as talking about the Russia connection, as you saw in the opening video. But just as a matter of example, when the Republican proposed the $1.5 trillion tax cut, it was not a mistake that they made by telling you it is for the people. It was not a mistake that they tell you that, well, you're going to get a huge tax cut. It was a deliberate lie that Republican leaders passed to the constituent. Now, we know that no Democrat believes that. There is no argument there. But Republican constituents believe their leaders were working to, well, give them a huge tax cut. Now, the reason that I take that particular example is because while they were telling the constituent, the Republican constituent, that they were going to get a huge tax cut, they were crafting legislation which take $1.3 trillion out of those 1.5 trillion, which means more than 85% of the money to give to large corporation and wealthy individual. But they never mentioned any such thing to the constituent. They never hinted at that to the constituent. But even much worse, they never mentioned that the constituent will be responsible for the whole 1.5 trillion. This is deception, not politics. As I mentioned earlier, it is no longer an argument as to the fact that Republican legislators lie to their constituent. This is no matter of argument anymore. It has happened over and over and over several decades now. The question is, why? Why would the Republican legislators want their constituent to stay dumb, to stay ignorant? We know that they do that so that they can keep their job, so that they can advance their political career. We know that that's the case. That's the reason that they do that. But the question is, why would they want the Republican constituent to stay dumb, to stay ignorant? They strive on that weakness of the Republican constituent. Now, don't get me wrong. There are a number of Republican constituents who've already figured that out, who've already determined that they're being dummified by their leaders. They've already exited the boat. But the majority stays and continue to be dummified by their Republican leaders. Again, as I say, that should not have been an issue for me or for anyone for that matter who is not any way related to any of those individuals. But look what happened in the 2016 presidential election. So the idea of completely ignoring this plague, ignoring the fact that Republican leaders are exploiting the ignorance of their constituent, but instead of educating them, continue to take advantage of that. This is not something that we can simply just walk away from. There is only one boat called the United States of America. No matter what each and every one of us think of the other individual, no matter whatever a political party thinks of the other political party, however upset a group of individuals within a particular party feel towards another group or other groups, there is one simple fact. We are all in one huge boat called the United States of America. No matter whatever happened to one part of that boat, one aspect of that boat, whoever is responsible to help keep that boat afloat, something happened to that individual becomes the responsibility of the rest of us. As such, we cannot just shrug it off. Now, a lot of individuals who have already given me their peace of mind, a piece of their mind rather, as to blurting out exactly what I have observed instead of trying to sugarcoating it. And that's something that we, people in the media, have been doing for the longest. And it doesn't seem to work. It doesn't seem to reach the individuals who are supposed to be reached by that. Trying to sugarcoat the fact that this is where we're at at this stage in our existence is no comfort at all. Now, for those who supported and voted for Donald Trump, they can argue till death that that was the best decision that they made in their lives. And they continue to think so, they continue to believe so. Now, there is, again, this danger of being fed false information, misinformation, disinformation. It's all around those individuals. They live in an environment where this is what they breathe on a regular basis. And the idea of someone trying to impart knowledge becomes a joke. I cannot tell you how many tweets that I got from individuals who simply, who don't have a way to engage in order to find more about a particular topic, but rather simply figure out the best way around it is to hurl insult at me, as if that's supposed to make me feel bad. And getting to think about it, I also ought to tell you something about myself. I might as well mention it. It's almost impossible for someone to hurt me through words, because no matter what you say does not impact my life. So it is very difficult. I met individuals not just over the internet who hurl insult. I met individuals on the street. I had interaction with individuals who had said things that would have got other people to be overly upset and even would get into a fist fight. I always look at individuals who do those things as individuals who hurl insult at others just for the sake of insulting others as ignorant. Needs to grow a little bit, become a little bit smarter, grow more in order to understand that doesn't accomplish anything. Now, what I say here on the forefront is not for the sake of insulting individuals, although I would be the first one to acknowledge that those cannot possibly feel good either. But there is a point behind the information. It's not just for the sake of saying that individuals in group X are ignorant and gullible and naive. The point is to expose that problem. Now, yes, you could be upset about it. You may even want to strangle me. But the idea is for those who are affected by the problem to understand where the problem comes from. Now, they may choose to ignore it, which is everyone's prerogative to do. But the idea is to, at the very least, present it so that you're aware of it. And if it is of any concern to you, you can work on it and change that. But the ignorance is one of the major issues the country is facing. The ignorance of several million individuals. And by ignorance, I don't mean people who don't go to school, people who didn't go to college. That's not what I meant. Because during the 2016 presidential election, it was common parlance that most individual, most people who didn't go to college would vote for Donald Trump. Now, that's not what I'm referring to. Not because someone didn't go to college, make that person an ignorant individual. In fact, you'll be surprised to find that some individuals who didn't go to college actually are way smarter than those who did. So college education doesn't make anyone less ignorant than someone who actually did go or did not go to college. This is not what we're talking about. If you don't know that you put your hands on fire, you will get burned, would that spare you from being burned if you put your hands on fire? Of course not. You will still get burned. Someone who suffers of cancer but doesn't know that he or she suffers of cancer, would that spare him of the outcome? Of course not. Ignorance is not something to strive for. It's not something to embrace. It's not something to cherish because it is bad. The ignorance of one voter in a democracy impairs the security of us all, said JFK. And we've seen it. We actually living that very fact today. So no, ignorance is not good for the country. And that brings me back to why do the Republican legislators, elected officials, strive on the ignorance of their constituent? Now, let's take the same example I gave before about the $1.5 trillion tax cut. If the Republicans were to be upfront and come to the constituent and say, we're going to take a $1.5 trillion loan, but 85% of that we're going to give to large corporation and wealthy individual. We're going to give you just 0.2, meaning 200 billion. And, oh, by the way, you're responsible for all the 1.5 trillion. Now you see why Republicans trade in deception. You understand why? Because they know this is not something that they can possibly sell to any individual, no matter what their level of education is. Because nobody would be stupid enough to go along with it. So what they did is they lie to their constituent. They deceive their constituent. And by deceive, I mean deliberately. This is not an accident. While they were behind the scene crafting legislation, because that's what the legislation did. They were crafting a legislation that would give 85% of $1.5 trillion that they borrow to large corporation and wealthy individual, and they would simply allocate 0.2 to the rest of the country. That's what they did. They weren't drunk. They spent months crafting that legislation, but they found it necessary to deceive the constituent about that. But unfortunately, the Republican constituent, as I mentioned over and over and over, are much too gullible, too naive, and they simply accept, despite the fact that those legislators have been doing that for decades now, and yet Republican constituents continue to accept whatever that they hear from their Republican leaders as if it was Bible truth. And that is a crisis for the country.
anywhere. The fourth branch program will return in just a moment.
After reading several books based on presidents and on Obama specifically, I found that they're typically partisan. The Obama legacy targets the heart of the issue by giving credit to the president where it's due, but definitely coming down hard on Obama on his bigger failures, like his handling of the Syrian crisis.
If you are in college, going to college, you are an educator, a faculty member, or someone with interest in government or politics, The Obama Legacy is definitely a book to read.
My professor recommended The Obama Legacy.
A friend actually recommended The Obama Legacy.
I would highly recommend this book for anyone, whether for academic use or leisure reading.
I would recommend this book to anyone out there searching for an impartial and unbiased look into Barack Obama's tenure as president.
I would definitely recommend this book as a good read for both liberals and conservatives.
It is almost pointless to try to convince any Trump supporter about all the different aspects of what has transpired during the 2016 presidential election with Russia. During that time, now just to back up a little bit, especially for those who have expressed so much hatred towards me for pointing on a regular basis and actually affirming almost that the idea that we had to wait for a Robert Mueller and the completion of investigation to know that Donald Trump was indeed in bed with Russia is pretty ludicrous. And the reason for that is because I had a conversation with one ardent supporter of Donald Trump and proposed an example, which I guess I had to come up with in order to see if I could get through with this evolution of facts and individual being indicted and pleading guilty and so on in regards to that problem. And I said, if you were to be married to someone and every time you turn around, you find someone who tell you that they slept with your spouse, or you find someone who say they know someone who slept with your spouse, and as you go along and pretty much ignoring that as fake news, so to speak, I said, how many individuals do you have to hear say those things in order for you to start realizing there is a problem with your spouse? In fact, I would bet that any individual, man or woman, who would have gotten the first individual to tell him or her that the spouse is unfaithful, that you would not just ignore it, shrug it off, or just think, well, doesn't matter. I doubt that very much. And that's the reason I believe that when I brought the example, I thought, well, maybe that would make a difference. How many individuals do you have to go through to either say outright they slept with your spouse, for whatever reason the individual would say that, this is not the argument here, or you'll find many individuals who say that they know that other people are sleeping with your spouse. Suppose that it's the individual who actually did the actual sleeping with your spouse, not the one telling you that, because that may be very dangerous for any individual to do something like that. But suppose, for sake of argument, that you're only getting that from others, maybe eyewitnesses, people who heard it, people who actually somehow related, friend, acquaintances to the individual who did the act of sleeping with your spouse. Let's suppose, for sake of argument, that that's what you're getting. 1, 2, 5, 10, 20. How many do you need for you to start seeing a pattern that there is definitely a problem? I said, would you shrug off all that? Would you simply ignore it as fake news? Just people saying things bad about your spouse, but there is no truth to it? Think about that for a moment and see the rationale behind it. Now, understandable, it could be one person that doesn't like your spouse and say something. It could be even a second person. It could be a third person. Maybe. But once you start seeing that, it becomes a pattern that everywhere you look, you're getting the same thing. Now, I don't know how naive anyone can be for you not to see that there is a problem. But in the case of the fact that Donald Trump, at least so far, his team, everybody around him, so far, that's what we know. Everybody around him. Think about that. We're talking about, if it were to be anybody else, we could say with a certain degree of, well, still not, but for sake of argument, anybody other than Donald Trump could have all those people around him doing all those bad things, but would not necessarily be involved. Sounds unlikely, but not impossible. Because those people could have been doing those things because they figured we don't want to get that individual, in that case Donald Trump, involved in case something goes wrong. So, in other words, they would have shielded him from all those things. So, at the end of the day, yes, Donald Trump would be completely innocent. But let's look at the facts, shall we? Number one, we know that Donald Trump, in his private life, nothing get done. Nothing about him or his business could be done. No one could take the initiative of doing anything without telling Donald Trump that we're going to do XYZ, or we would like to do XYZ, or we're thinking about doing XYZ, and get Donald Trump's blessing. That's facts. Number two, facts. Donald Trump never in his private life never did in his private life anything that was legal or legitimate. Those are documented facts. Never once in his life, even when he was learning from his father, he was learning how to scheme the system, how to defraud people. So we know, at the very least, those two important facts about Donald Trump. Everything that's gonna be done for Donald Trump has to be run by him first. No one would dare doing anything for Donald Trump without running it by him first. Not even his children. No one. And two, we know that Donald Trump doesn't do anything legal or legitimate. For those who continue to argue for on behalf of Donald Trump, those are the two facts to keep in mind, to factor in when you're arguing on behalf of Donald Trump. One, everything that ought to be done, if it ought to be done for Donald Trump, has to be run by him first. No one would dare doing anything without running it by him. And second, Donald Trump has never done anything legal or legitimate. Pour over everything about Donald Trump's private life. Nothing legal or legitimate. Now, that still doesn't say too much about whether he was involved or not, except for he told us he was involved. Publicly, he told us he wanted to be involved. He was involved. It's not something Donald Trump, during the 2016 presidential election, he put it right in front of us. That's the reason that we become almost desensitized by crime committed openly. First time in the history of the United States of America, we have the President of the United States committing crime openly. And that's the reason it becomes almost impossible to wrap our head around that, because who does that? Everything that Donald Trump did during the 2016 presidential election, everything that he has done thus far as President of the United States, you take any of those things and have them done behind the scene in secrecy, you see the severity of those things. Now, because they're being done openly, doesn't mean they're less of a crime either. It simply means Donald Trump is brazen. He relies on the Republican to protect him, the Republican legislators who refuse to do their job, which is to make certain that the integrity of the country is protected, who refuse to make certain that the Constitution is what comes first. So Donald Trump is not solely responsible for the problem that I'm describing. I hinted at the following before, that I am fairly certain that other Republicans were also involved with the Russia scandal. And that would be the only logical reason, the only logical step for those who were involved to make certain that things doesn't really go too fast, doesn't really go too far, and thus expose them as also part of the problem. As you saw the past 2 years, Republican congressmen, the leaders, Devin Nunes, Jim Jordan, Mark Meadows, Trey Gowdy, they were all using their position to protect Donald Trump. At first, it was a frustrating thing for anyone who loves the country, anyone who is a patriot. It was frustrating at first to try to understand why in the world legislators whose job is to rein in, to put a check on the executive branch, but they were the one who were actually helping. So it was frustrating. So I had to take a look through different prisms of the situation. First, I had to figure out, could the Republican legislators be so partisan, so ignorant, so naive to believe that Donald Trump had nothing to do with Russia? The answer is probably not. Legislators, they're not that naive. So the next question is, of course, the media has been saying that they protecting Donald Trump because of the fact that they want to keep their job. So if Donald Trump speaks against them, then they may lose that job. In other words, the only reason, at least that's the media way of explaining Republican behavior. So the only reason that they're protecting Donald Trump is, well, because they want to protect their job. At first, I bought the argument. I went along with the argument. Because I thought, sounds logical, maybe. Then I realized something that we have not talked about. The mainstream media has not picked up on that yet. But then I realized that, no, that cannot be. Because even if an individual was to want badly to protect his job, but too many things were done by the Trump administration that were bad for the country, that were detrimental for the country. And if you remember the performance in Helsinki in July 16, 2018, Trump performance in Helsinki, forget about the behind the scene conversation he had with Vladimir Putin. The performance, the public performance, the worldwide performance should have been a breaking point for any individual who is a patriot, for you to say, you know what, this is not acceptable. Much more so legislators. And yet, nothing of this sort did matter. We found out that before the Helsinki performance, a Republican delegation, exclusively Republican delegation, went to Russia before the Helsinki, whatever we would want to call that. I don't know if it was a meeting, a conference, or whatever that they want to call it, but it was clear to me none of that was done for the sake of the United States. In general, in case you didn't know, in general, when the United States of America, when legislators decide to go to visit another country, for whatever reason, whether it's to bring the two countries together, to iron out diplomatic issues, and so on and so forth, the delegation always comprised of members of both parties until Russia, until July 2018, when a Republican delegation refused to accept any Democrat of being part of that delegation. And the pictures start shaping, for me at least, that this is not just a Donald Trump problem. Republican delegation went to Russia, spent 4th of July in Russia. Today, up to today, the country has no idea what the Republican delegation talked to Russia about. Oh yes, they did tell us. They went there to establish rapport with their Russian counterparts. That's as much as the country got from that delegation. Now, if you're not naive enough to believe that, first, why did they exclude Democrats? That's the first question that should be asked, because every time a U.S. delegation, even when we visit Canada, which is an ally, a neighbor next door, delegation always comprises of Democrat and Republican until Russia. The question is, what is exactly going on? We put our focus on Donald Trump because, well, Donald Trump has a big mouth. So he speaks, he has a loud mouth, and the Republican legislators take advantage of that in order to help with the cover-up of a crime that I am fairly certain, when I started to put those pieces together, it starts showing a picture that clearly tells me that Donald Trump was not alone in the Russia scandal. After the first delegation, then there was a second delegation led by none other than Rand Paul. I remember McCain warned us about Rand Paul. Donald Trump went to Helsinki to meet with Vladimir Putin behind the scene, talked for hours. No one knows up to today what they talked about. And then the performance clearly tells us Donald Trump sold the country. But no Republican was outraged. Talking about Republican legislators. No, there was no outrage, because as far as they're concerned, this is fine. Yes, Donald Trump is taking the hit for the rest of us. Yes, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but when you start putting the pieces together, it starts making sense why Republican legislators, who also took an oath to protect the country, suddenly throw everything away. In fact, if you notice, Republicans during the past 2 years work very aggressively to destroy the institution which have protected the United States of America. They attack FBI, they attack CIA, they attack Department of Justice. It's not just Donald Trump with his mouth. In fact, Donald Trump has a big mouth. That's all he does. He just attacked them with his mouth. But the people who actually had done the greatest damage to the country are the Republican legislators. They the one. Yes, our focus has been on Donald Trump because, well, maybe that's a strategy. It keeps the focus on him while the Republicans, who are also accomplices, they working whatever magic that they can in order to make the whole problem go away. We caught Devin Nunes on tape. Oh, I did mention today I would put it up, but I forgot about that. But I promise you that I will bring that up. We caught Devin Nunes on tape. Devin Nunes, who was the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, plotting to derail the investigation. So it's not just me, like, it sounds like conspiracy theory, but it starts becoming, it starts taking shape that Republican, at least, I'm sure it's not all of them, but a number of Republicans were also part of that problem, the Russia scandal. They've been trying to get, it's not just Donald Trump saying it with his mouth, but those who are in a position to see report, to understand whether this investigation is going, they've been trying the hardest for them to stop, to derail, to slow down the investigation. I took particular note at Trey Gowdy, who was trying to rush the special counsel. Trey Gowdy spent years investigating the Benghazi attack, despite the fact that investigation after investigation after investigation clearly say that there is nothing there. There were at least 7 investigations done on the Benghazi. And yes, Trey Gowdy, at some point during the 2016 presidential election, when it seemed that Hillary was going to be president, you start hearing that there is going to be another investigation of the Benghazi attack. So Trey Gowdy especially was not an individual who should have at any point tried to rush the investigation. And yet, they all were doing exactly the same thing. Those are not coincidences. There are many bits and pieces that are showing up on our screen that tell us that Donald Trump is not alone. One of the most important piece, one important piece rather of this big, gigantic puzzle that Robert Mueller is putting together is not the idea of Russia meddling in the 2016 election, which we know Russia, China, a number of foreign actors have been trying to do that to the United States for the longest. Before Donald Trump, there were actors trying to infiltrate our technology, the technology system, whichever way they could. Donald Trump offered a door into the country. He opened the door, but he wasn't the only one opening the door. He was the catalyst of doing so. So we know that the country is in serious jeopardy, not because Russia meddled in the 2016 election. As long as there are foreign actors who are not allies, we can always expect that we will have those actors trying to do damage to the country. That is a given. We don't have to think about it twice. The bigger aspect of the problem is the enemy within. That we have Republican legislators, elected officials. See who the Russian went to. The NRA. They targeted, the Russians targeted Republicans in particular. And by targeted, I don't mean trying to hack. I don't mean that. I mean targeted in terms of those are easy individual, easy target, easy people to get to in order to fulfill whatever nefarious agenda that they have. They could easily get to Donald Trump and they could easily get to Republicans. And yes, our problem is not Russia. Because today it's Russia, tomorrow it could be China, tomorrow the next day it could be North Korea. So actors may change. Our problem today, we're putting the focus on Russia, but our problem is not Russia. Our problem is the legislators who have abandoned their primary duty, who have trashed the oath they took to protect the country and sleep with the enemy. That's the problem we have in the United States of America. And that problem, ladies and gentlemen, is not a problem to shrug off, because it's causing serious damage to the United States of America, the only boat that we have. In 1996, a small network by the name of Fox News was launched with just 17 million viewers. Today, with over 100 million people watching regularly, Fox has become the greatest threat to our democracy, constantly bombarding the airwaves with false information, distortion of facts, and outright lies presented to its audience as news. Fox has created an army of blissful ignorance. According to a survey, 82% of Fox viewers are ignorant of facts and the truth. To keep millions of people in ignorance not only prevents democracy from flourishing, but it also clears the path to authoritarianism, to dictatorship. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." Let me finish by saying that democracy cannot survive in an environment where truth and facts do not matter. At Fox, truth and facts do not matter. Indeed, democracy in America is in jeopardy. It is a crisis the country can no longer ignore. you have watched this program for the first time, welcome to War on Blacks. It's a topic in which we discuss race relations in America. Now, War on Blacks label or banner was not picked for the sake of sensation. We pick War on Blacks in order to point to a very important part of the race relation: the casualties inflicted on blacks. Physical casualties, emotional casualties, psychological casualties, and yes, financial casualties. We have come to a point in our discussion. We've been talking about race relation in America, specifically slavery, and we talk about the rebellion. We talk about slave escaping, trying to escape slavery, and we talk also about the fact that some slaves now decided to inflict some harm on their masters before escaping. And we got to a point where we talk about the last individual, John Brown, was a white individual who fought against slavery. Now, if you join for the first time, let me set the stage for you. One, we know that there are two major groups of whites in the country. Millions of whites who are racist and discriminate, and millions of whites who are not racist and who do not discriminate. We also acknowledge that you today, whether you are black or white, you were not there, you were not here, you were not alive, you were not born yet during slavery. Slavery ended officially in 1865. So I doubt very much there is anyone today who is alive who was around during slavery. But we also mentioned that despite the fact that we had left that period of that in our history behind, we blacks in general still live under a system which was put in place by white in order to prevent blacks from advancing, in order to continue to inflict pains on blacks even beyond slavery. Now, we gave you a small window into the sentiment that whites have expressed towards blacks. And that sentiment, although we could say that whites were never liked blacks to begin with, they had a specific state of mind in terms of what they think, how they perceive blacks. That's the reason they went to Africa and they chased blacks like animals, shot them down and captured them and sold them like merchandise. So whites never have never feel that blacks are worth anything to them. Now, although that sounds like a blanket statement, it is not, because we've been saying it all along that even during slavery, there were two groups of whites. Even during slavery, there were whites who were completely opposed to the idea of enslaving individuals. And of course, there were those who thought, great idea. We could do that. Why not? And besides, the idea of enslaving others bring wealth, fortune to many of them. But as mentioned before, we are not here to discuss the detail of slavery, but rather to show why today, mid-21st century, racism is still much alive in America. And we want to continue to point to the fact that when we talk about racism in America, we're talking about institutionalized racism. Not someone you meet across the street or on the train or at school, at work, who is racist. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about institutionalized racism. It is the system which nurtures, which condone, or even promotes racist behavior, actions, and languages. Now, Nat Turner was a slave, tried to escape, and John Brown, white man who was completely against slavery, they both did some real damage to whites. Killed, burned plantation, killed whites who were either pro-slave or encouraged slavery. And they both, Nat Turner and John Brown, they both met with death, execution. John Brown was executed, was captured in October of 1859, just a couple of years before the Civil War erupted. As mentioned before, John Brown just couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't wait for those individuals who were fighting to end slavery. He fought with his life. He even enlisted his own family, 5 of his sons, to fight to end slavery. 4 of those sons lost their lives. Now, as mentioned yesterday, we are embarking into another important period in the history of America. We started with slaves, chained, beat, tortured, to slaves who try to escape, burn plantation, escape slavery, get caught, executed, hung, and those are at various times during slavery, things that happen until we reach John Brown, who was one of those as I mentioned before, he wasn't alone in terms of whites who were against slavery. When the last fight, at least he thought that was going to be the fight to put an end to slavery, he had 22 men. Only 5 blacks. All the others, including himself and his family, they were all whites. So yes, there were always whites who would not accept those type of things, those type of treatment to other individuals. And that's what makes the discussion of race relation in America so difficult, because up to today we have those two groups starkly divided. Whites who are racist, who discriminate, and whites who are not racist, who do not discriminate. When we continue this conversation, that hopefully tomorrow, we will cross the bridge of the Civil War, and while crossing that bridge, we will show you the sentiment that was amplified, the sentiment of the whites, those who were pro-slavery, how their sentiment against against the idea of ending slavery, amplified, and what that means as far as what the country will be like even beyond slavery. I am MD, host of the Fourth Branch program, inviting you to join me every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. and every weekday at 2 p.m. for discussions of social political issues and to dissect the meaning and the importance of current events, as well as to understand topics of legislations. The Fourth Branch Project is not associated with any political party, and we at the Fourth Branch do not have any political agenda or aspiration. Our ultimate objective is to work towards achieving a more perfect union by removing ignorance, the biggest obstacle to our democracy. Stay with us. We will be right back. I do thank you for spending the time with me, and I hope this information was enlightening. In the meantime, if you have any question, suggestion, comments, criticism, and yes, even if you have a way to help improve this program, do not hesitate to contact us. Should you have any topic you would like us to talk about, let us know. We will research and we will debate it on this program. You have a wonderful afternoon. Hope to see you again tomorrow at 2 p.m. The Fourth Branch Podcast is brought to you in collaboration with the People Branch publication, which can be found on the People Branch website, located at peoplebranch.org. That's peoplebranch.org. That's peoplebranch.org website, in which you will find a number of very interesting articles. My name is Mike Duchesne, MD for short. I hope you have a great afternoon or a great evening, whichever it happens to be. Hopefully you can join me again next time for another interesting episode of this podcast. That was the Fourth Branch, live from New York. Good day.